Hey, what's up guys? Here I'm going to show you a world I created of the game The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This was definitely my favorite game that I played growing up, and I eventually decided to build and recreate this world as a fun thing to do in my spare time. So I'm just going to give a walkthrough of this game to show what I built in this world as compared to the actual game itself. Here we have Link's house, where the game first starts out. While creating this world, I tried to pay attention to detail as best as I possibly could. With every tree, every rock, every bush, every flower, just the landscape in general, I tried to make everything as precisely to scale as it was in the game. So everything you see here was actually built on flat land with nothing on it, and I did everything with one block at a time. And here is the secret passageway to get into the castle. This is where you find Link's uncle, and I put what looks like a little blood spot there since you find him injured. And here we have Hyrule Castle. This was actually the first thing I started to work on when I was creating this world. I didn't actually plan on building the entire game when I was first building the castle. I just kept adding on more and more until I eventually decided to just do the entire game at that point. And here's where you head into the dungeon where Zelda's located. This area has those bottomless pits you could sometimes get knocked into. I actually started building this world about 7 years ago on my old Xbox 360, and since this is the outdated version of Minecraft, I've had to improvise a lot of the things I can use to make this world look like how it was in the game, with the block textures that were available. And this is the prison cell where you find Zelda. I'm going to fast forward real quick so we can get through the parts that we just went through. This is the throne room where you and Zelda push that ornamental shelf out of the way to get into the sewers. One of the tricky parts with building the sewers was that I needed to line it up with the graveyard and the sanctuary that are above ground. And so if you haven't already noticed, a lot of the doorways and stairwells kind of make weird turns. And also I figured it wouldn't matter how the stairwells turn out because you can't really see them anyways since they don't get shown in the game. And now we come up to the sanctuary. This was definitely a very fun thing to build. And here is one of the fortune teller's houses. And now we enter Kakariko Village. So the thing with the houses is that I wanted to make them as close to scale on the outside as I possibly could. But in the game, you can make a house however small you want on the outside and then put as much space as you want on the inside, kind of like those tents that are in the 4th Harry Potter movie. So I still tried to make everything as accurate as I could on the inside, but it's just a little more condensed in some places. And this is the bar where you can get this magic bottle through going through the secret entrance back here. And then the bug catching kid's house is over here. So this picture here, in my opinion, kind of looks like Mario. And in the game, there actually is a picture of Mario there, and also one in this house. And if you pull on this one, it'll give you some rupees. And this is the Dwarven Smith's house, where later in the game you can upgrade the Master Sword into the Tempered Sword once you find the Lost Partner. And this is that shrine where if you sprinkle your magic powder there, a bat will appear and says he dropped your magic usage down by half. And this is the library where you eventually get the Book of Medora, which allows you to get into the second pendant's dungeon. And then there's this little maze minigame where you have to try to find your way to the end before the time runs out. And if you're successful, you're rewarded with a piece of heart, and I marked that spot there where you would get it. And this is the Haunted Grove where the flute boy plays, and you actually can dig up the flute later. Here's a little hidden fairy fountain. Under this bridge is where you can find a guide that will give you a magic bottle. And this is the area that leads up to the first pendant dungeon. So since this dungeon is pretty large, I had to make most of it go underground since it wouldn't fit above ground. So I not only had to build and design the entire dungeon underground, but I also had to dig out all the dirt blocks to make the space for it. In this part of the dungeon, there are cannonballs that'll shoot from one side of the room to the other that you have to walk through and dodge. Obviously they're not actually moving, but I put them there as a representation. With the walls of this dungeon, I wanted them to look like they were older or decaying, and so I used mossy stone bricks with the regular stone bricks, and I randomly placed them in certain patterns just all throughout the dungeon, and that was definitely very tedious to do. This is supposed to look like one of those stone tablets where you can communicate to Sahasrara with. And this is the big chest where you get the bow once you get the master key. after you defeat all of the enemies in this room, this is where you get the Master Key. And this room has a bunch of cannonballs that are shooting all around you that you have to dodge and find the right button to push to open the door. Now, here is the room where you fight the final boss of this dungeon. So I attempted to build what the bosses look like, but obviously it's not perfect, since there's only so much you can do with a little bit of space. But I tried to make it look like they're holding a spear and a shield and made them blue. Okay, so I somehow glitched through the floor underneath everything that I built. But I figured I'd go ahead and show you this anyways, since it's a pretty cool looking cave, and you get to see behind the scenes everything that I built on the underside. And this long line that I'm following used to be the border of the landscape that I moved to the right further. And I'll go ahead and show you more of the cave later under Death Mountain once we get there. This is all what we were just underneath. And this is Sahasrar's hideout where he gives you the Pegasus boots once you beat the first dungeon. This is another fortune teller's house. And this is Lake Hylia. And this island that's in the center of the lake, in the cave inside, there's a fairy that will appear if you throw a certain amount of rupees into the pond. And she will increase the amount of bombs or arrows that you can carry at maximum. This is a cave where you can obtain the ice rod. This area is called the Great Swamp. This structure here has a gate inside that if you pull a lever, it'll open and release a bunch of water. This later is used to gain access to the Swamp Palace dungeon in the Dark World. This is one of those monuments where if you have the Master Sword, you'll be given a magic medallion. And now we enter the Desert of Mystery. And with the Book of Medora, you can make your wish here to move forward into the second Pendants dungeon. Again, with this dungeon, I had to make it go underground because there's not enough space above ground to fit it all. That green thing there with the head on it is supposed to be one of those eye statues that circle around and shoot laser beams at you. Once you have the master key, you can open the big chest here and get the power glove, which allows you to lift up rocks. And this is the room where you get the master key, and those heads that are on the wall are actually just supposed to be those little green cannons that shoot cannonballs back and forth. Through here, there is another exit out of the dungeon, and there's actually one like this on the other side that I'll go through in a second. And here are the two exits that I was talking about previously. So here is the second half of the dungeon where once you have the power glove you can lift the rocks to get inside. This is supposed to be the room where those tiles all start to levitate and hurl themselves at you. One of the tricky things about building this dungeon was that the first and second half of the dungeon were going the same direction. So I had to build the second half of the dungeon on top of the first half. So what we're walking on right now is actually right above the first half of the dungeon that we just went through. And here's the room where you fight the final boss for this dungeon. There's only so much you can do with building the boss since it's just 3 caterpillars that jump out of the ground, but this gives the gist of it. This is just a house in the lower part of the village I forgot to show earlier, where you can pay to open a chest and hope you find the best treasure. Since you have the power glove, you can lift that rock now to get on top of the mountain, but we'll head up there in a second. This is the house of the twin lumberjacks. And during the game, they're actually slowly cutting down a tree over here where eventually you can break it open and get into this cave where there's a piece of heart. And now we'll head up to Death Mountain through this cave. Building the caves of this mountain was actually pretty tricky because not only did I have to match the layout of the caves, but I also had to add elevation and try to make it match up with the top of the mountain. And now we're on Death Mountain. This is the cave entrance where the old man will give you the magic mirror. and this is just another cave that gets you down the mountain. And this here that looks like sunglasses is called Spectacle Rock. So I decided to make the clouds myself instead of using the ones that are naturally in Minecraft, so that I can make them the shape of how they were in the game, and also since you can't see anything above the clouds that are in Minecraft. And now for the third pendant dungeon, the Tower of Hera. This was definitely a very fun dungeon to build. So in this dungeon there are button switches that if you hit will make these block panels go up and down like this. So I decided to include those by using these levers to activate the pistons. Originally I didn't want the redstone dust on the ground to be visible, but since I care how the tower looks more on the outside, I didn't want to make the floor thicker to try to cover it up. And this is another one of those rooms where those floor tiles will throw themselves at you. And here's where the master key is for this dungeon. These black spots on the ground are supposed to look like those holes that are in the game where you can drop down to the previous floor with. I didn't want to make them actual holes since it looks strange having gaps everywhere. Since this dungeon is a tower, I wanted each level on the outside to look like it was getting a little bit smaller like how it does in the game. So as you go through the dungeon, every floor tends to get a little bit smaller, and so everything gets a little more condensed as you go up, but I still try to get the gist of it. This here is supposed to be like one of those fire rods that'll spin in circles and sometimes knock you off the edge. And these blue things are supposed to look like those octagons that'll bounce you away if you touch them. And here's the top floor where you fight the final boss. And again, there's only so much you can do with creating the boss with a little bit of space, but you get the idea. So even though it was a lot of work, I wanted to include all the trees in the background behind the mountain, because in the game, when you walk on the bridges, you can see them all down below. Here's the portal that'll take you to the Dark World if you hammer those 3 posts in the correct order. So this side of Death Mountain has a lot more caves than the other side does, and it was definitely very difficult to connect them all together. I had to make some of the entrances and staircases extra long so that I could fit and connect everything inside the mountain. In the game, when you walk through a staircase, the screen will black out for a couple seconds and then you'll reappear on the other end. In all reality, you're actually skipping a lot more than a couple seconds in some cases. For instance, we just started on top of the mountain there and we ended up down here after going through that long staircase previously. So some of these caves have a logic to them that doesn't actually make sense. For instance, this cave that we're leaving right now is actually supposed to be below this cave right here. But strangely, this entrance here is actually lower and more behind this other cave, where you're supposed to be able to drop into. With some of the caves, I had to make the entrances turn in different directions than they'd appear to in the game. Otherwise, the caves would interfere with each other and wouldn't fit. It was kind of like working with a giant jigsaw puzzle. In some of these caves, you can actually drop through these dark holes to get to the cave beneath it. This one here didn't actually quite line up, so I just made it a tunnel so it could still get to the treasure chest. This is the broken bridge that requires you to use the hookshot to get to the other side of the mountain down here. I decided to make the ground of the valley black like this because when you're on the lower part of the mountain and you look down, it looks dark. When you head over from this direction here, you will come to the witch's hut. This is the hidden fairy fountain behind the waterfall where the fairy will upgrade your boomerang and shield. And this is Zora's Lake. I loved building this area since it feels nice and open with all the water and trees. This is where the great Zora can be found, who will sell you the flippers that allow you to swim. So this area here gets higher from left to right, even though in the game it appears to be flat. But when you hover over in the air like this, it has the same layout as it does in the game. So I'm going to show you the caves underneath everything I built again and pick up where I left off. So down here you get to see my first attempt at building this part of Zora's Lake. As you can see, it's actually flat like how it's supposed to look in the game. I'll explain why I had to add elevation to it after I show you the rest of underneath Death Mountain. And here's a giant labyrinth of caves that I have intertwined around each other. Down here you can see the ruins of how far out I originally had the witch's hut area located. The reason why everything was extended out this far was because when I first built the castle I made it too large and had to redo and push back a lot of things in the surrounding areas. And this is where the castle sewers lead into the back side of the sanctuary. So the reason why the lake gets higher here is because when I was building this area, I didn't realize that in order for the waterfalls to actually drop down, logically the lake would need to get higher, even though when you're walking through it in the game, it doesn't appear to. Now we're entering the Lost Woods. This definitely took a lot of time and effort to build because of how many trees there are. Here is the thieves' hideout, where if you break this middle bush and drop down, you'll get a piece of heart. This is another place where you pay to open a random treasure chest. So even though there are a lot of trees everywhere, I couldn't just use saplings and bone meal to grow them all. A lot of the times I had to build each tree from scratch, because if you use saplings, sometimes the trees would grow weird or become ginormous, and oftentimes it would take longer to fix these trees rather than just building them myself. In some areas, such as Zora's Lake, or the grove surrounding the Master Sword, I had to build all of those trees individually, since they have different leaves than what would normally grow on them. And after you come from over here, you'll find this log that will lead you to the grove where the Master Sword is hidden. And this is the graveyard. If you push open this grave over here, it will reveal a secret entrance into the castle sewers. There's also another grave over here that has a secret cave underneath it where you can find the magic cape. And now, since you have the Master Sword in your possession, you can use it to break open an electric barrier that would block you from getting into the final dungeon of the Light World, the Castle Tower. So, as I previously mentioned in this video, when I first built a castle, I made it too large because I was trying to make the inside accurate to scale. And since it interfered with the rest of the map, I ended up having to redo a lot of the castle, including the entire top part that we're in right now. So I really love building this dungeon, but it's definitely very difficult to connect each floor with every staircase and fit all the rooms together. So, since every floor gets a little bit smaller as you go up, at the very top of the tower, the rooms turn in different directions than they'd appear to in the game. Otherwise, they'd stick out kind of strange from the top of the castle. This is where you find Zelda after she was kidnapped from the sanctuary. And then Ganon will seal her away and then teleport behind these curtains into the next room where you'll fight him. So this map gives a rough layout of the top view of this world, and since I've pretty much gone through everything now, I wanted to show it to you since I think it's pretty cool. This project definitely took a lot of time and careful planning, but it was also very fun and satisfying to watch everything come together piece by piece. And since A Link to the Past was my favorite game, it was very cool to build it all in 3D. There definitely was a lot of bumps in the road along the way, but in the end, I'm happy with how everything turned out. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.